Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ed Bowen, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the fourth Welfare and Safety of the Racehorse Summit presented by the Jockey Club and Grayson-Jockey Club Research Foundation. I appreciate your attendance, especially those who will be making presentations today and tomorrow. And we thank Keeneland, which from the beginning has been a generous and cooperative host to these presentations. The new president of Keeneland, Bill Thomason, is in the audience, and I appreciate if you'd like to give an applause to Keeneland. For those of you who are in racetrack management, you might be jealous that Bill has 100% good weather for running a racetrack. So, now the tradition before a speech is to give a joke, but at 8:30 I don't do funny, so you'll be glad to know you won't hear a corny joke. I'll just get started into this presentation. My role this morning is to give you a brief background on how these summits came about, what steps have been made as a result of them being held, and how the summits represent a collective striving for the benefit of the racehorse. In April of 2005, the directors of Grayson-Jockey Club Research Foundation, of which I'm president, asked me to convene a meeting of industry stakeholders to discuss their individual priorities relative to funding research. The mission of the foundation is to seek out, evaluate, and fund the best possible veterinary research to further the cause of protecting the health and soundness of the horse. As a general mission, all horses are included. We wanted to make sure that we were not veering off in directions of research which were at odds with the priorities held by a wide mix who attended the meeting: breeders, owners, trainers, organization leadership, and veterinarians. The results were gratifying that we weren't losing touch with the concerns of the industry. As would be expected, however, various individuals did have their own top priorities. So from this 2005 meeting, and with input from the executives of the parent company, the Jockey Club, grew the idea to organize the initial Welfare and Safety of the Racehorse Summit. Here we would bring together top leaders in the field to identify goals and carve out strategies for seeking to achieve those goals. The very nature of the exercise was that in most instances, it would require steady slogging to mobilize like-minded individuals to march toward the results we sought. I need not remind you that the horse industry, and the thoroughbred industry in particular, is well known for its strong-minded individuals, its disparate leadership and governance, and a host of problems which from time to time threaten to distract us from the core devotion to the good of the horse. From the initial summit of 2006 came a series of committees, and each left here with specific goals and strategies. I'm proud of those strategies which have led to progress and appreciate the strength of conviction of the chairs of each committee and their ability to be consensus builders. Where progress has been made, it generally has been fueled by clear thinking, worthy purpose, and dynamic individuals. Perhaps the most visible and expansive program to grow out of the first summit was the equine injury database. The spirit of this effort is and was Dr. Mary Scolay, whose long service as a commissioned veterinarian gave her great insight into the need of the industry to track and measure catastrophic injury. This is not simply a matter of keeping score. In fact, the main use of the database was envisioned as a learning device, identify what was going on, risk factors as it were, and analyze how those risks might be minimized in the future. This took a combination of intelligence, singularity of purpose, and benevolent use of technology. The idea was to create a form which veterinarians would be asked to fill out, providing a consistent menu of information on catastrophic injuries. What was the race distance, track condition, what were the ages and genders of injured horses, where on the track did injury occur? I well remember Dr. Scolay's nod to realism. If it takes more than a minute, she said, it won't get done. To create a system that would accommodate that, we turned to Encompass Solutions, one of the Jockey Club's commercial companies, which serves racetracks, especially racing offices. Without cost to any entity but itself, Encompass created a form which was easy to fill out and yet very intense in information. Dr. Scolay, along with the members of the Jockey Club staff, notably Kristen Warner-Leshney, started out on the slog I mentioned. They contacted more than 100 racetracks, cajoling, emphasizing the importance of the industry to the industry, and stressing how it would help us protect our horses. We knew from the beginning that we were not going to alter human nature and that racetracks would be reluctant to sign on to publicizing results when they themselves could not predict the impression their own stats might create. Thus, confidentiality agreements were a key necessity if the plan were to be widely embraced. No track can access another track's figures, but each has provided his own. Of course, we would like to see as much transparency as possible and admire those tracks which have chosen to make their individual results public. Dr. Scalay and Kristen and their associates were convincing, and today 89 racetracks are on board with this daily routine, accounting for 93% of flat racing and all of steeplechase racing in the United States. Even so, this was not a matter of sign them up and then sit back and watch the database fill. Kristen and Dr. Scalay have a meeting virtually every week in which they exercise quality control, identifying when racetracks are lagging behind or sending less than complete information and contacting them to correct the issue retrospectively and going forward. From the beginning, the database has been work-intensive, and only through this constant monitoring are we in position later this morning to present the world-renowned epidemiologist, Dr. Tim Parkin, who will update you on the latest analysis and what it means to the overall aims of the injury database. In speaking of results of past summits, I want always to emphasize that wherever there has been progress, there has been wide buy-in. That's a necessity. I admire Dr. Scalay for the idea, but without the cooperation of all those racetracks, nothing would have been accomplished. And just as there is plenty of work required behind the scenes in the Jockey Club offices, there is plenty of day-to-day effort required at each of the participating racetracks, and we appreciate and acknowledge that. Also, we are very appreciative that the sort of extra seal of approval was given the equine injury database when the National Thoroughbred Racing Association incorporated participation in the EID as a requirement for the racetrack accreditation program. I turn now to another original summit committee, the Education and Licensing Committee. The original mandate of this committee was to develop a sustainable program of continuing education for those participants charged with the day-to-day care of our athletes. Taking examples from virtually all other professions that require licensed or certified participants in a particular trade to remain current, this committee has demonstrated progress in an area that usually is closely guarded and at times is considered trade secrets. One of the myriad challenges faced by this group has been to simply determine the starting point, to understand the core level of expertise currently held among 7,000 plus licensed trainers and many other thousands of licensed grooms, to know where to begin tailoring continuing education programs. In the periodic meetings of the Education Licensing Committee, we have grappled with the problems of, one, how do you articulate the need for trainers and other licensees to undergo periodic education? Two, what are the advantages? And three, where is the educational content coming from? And hanging over all discussion is the question of, does it have to be mandatory? If so, it would have to be prescribed by racing commissions, so there you have a whole additional echelon to recruit and convince. Rather than dealing totally in theory, the Education and Licensing Committee set out at once on a specific initiative. Under the guidance of Kathy O'Mara and Jamie Hayden of the Jockey Club's Industry Initiatives Department, we produced a suggested Uniform National Trainers Test. This is intended for new licensees and represented an initial but important step, and it was designed to improve on what they found to be an uneven system in which some states require more stringent testing than others. To date, this is something of a partial victory. While we might point with some satisfaction that 14 jurisdictions now utilize all or part of our proposed test, the sobering reality is that a majority of jurisdictions do not. Fortunately, there is a precedent for formalized training of licensees. Dr. Reed McClellan's Groom Elite program is one of those behind-the-scenes success stories that are not the less important for their lack of publicity. Groom Elite involves classes Dr. McClellan conducts from racetrack to racetrack. In some cases, trainers of these grooms have become impressed enough by the fact that he is making their employees better horsemen that they increase the salary of anyone who has undergone that program. Of course, Groom Elite achieves its success without those classes being mandatory. The Racing Commissions International, RCI, has signed off on the concept of continuing education for trainers. Among the elements of this summit that I'm most excited about will be presentations from the California Horse Racing Board's developing education program and the Indiana Racing Commission's recently established mandatory CE program. I like to think that the summit committee was helpful in moving this along by creating some noise, but I'm most appreciative and admiring of the fact that these two states have been self-starters of this important work. And additionally, this summit today and tomorrow even counts as Indiana CE credit for trainers. A pet example of mine on why I feel so strongly of the desirability of continuing education was a conversation I had with a racetrack manager a few years ago. We had just heard a presentation of Dr. Sue Stover's research, which led to the recognition that in approximately 90% of the cases of serious racetrack injury, there was pre-existing pathology. I asked how many of this manager's trainers did he thought understood this, and his guess was about 10%. It is well known that doctors, veterinarians, teachers, and lawyers all have to undergo continuing education. A young lady who worked for the Jockey Club at the time of these first discussions about CE pointed out that she held a license as a hairdresser, and she too had to take a CE course every year to maintain that license. We must make the point to trainers that there is research going on all the time, and it is to be expected that from time to time new knowledge will be available. And that new knowledge might help them do a better job at keeping their horses sound, or at least give them some thought-provoking options to consider. A trainer's life is pretty hectic, and expecting them to seek out new information on their own is not as user-friendly as organizing for them some occasional classes, either in person or by computer. I think when you see the California and Indiana presentations later, you will agree that continuing education is both desirable and doable, and it need not be an onerous burden. The next committee I would like to review is the Shoeing and Healthcare Committee, chaired by Bill Kasner. This is an example of dynamic leadership backing good science and vice versa. At the first summit, Mr. Kasner made a presentation based largely on Dr. Stover's well-established work showing that high toe grabs on front shoes increase the risk of injury. This science had been done some time before, but it seemed so counterintuitive to many horsemen that it had not led to reform. I certainly understand that if you want a trainer to change something that he or she has always believed was in the best interest of the horse, then the onus is on you to make a very powerful presentation, a strong case. Mr. Kasner's presentation that day was just that, a very strong case. And he later made a similar presentation before the RCI annual meeting. Finally, understanding the facts prompted action. Today, 13 states restrict front toe grabs to 2 millimeters, and 4 others restrict them to 4 millimeters. The sale companies Keeneland, Fasig-Tipton, and Barrett's all agreed to restrict front toe grabs to 2 millimeters. And the NTRA adopted the 4 millimeter limit for its safety and integrity racetrack accreditation program. We, of course, appreciate that leadership. We all understood from the beginning, of course, that the summit can only make its case. We neither have nor presume to have any enforcement function. The Shoeing and Healthcare Committee also produced a DVD on hoof care, and this product has been viewed on the web over 25,000 times in 95 different countries. We were talking about that in the office the other day, and I don't think any of us could name 95 countries, but that's impressive. It is available free to download. Given its widespread acceptance and usage, we went back and produced a Spanish language version after request within the industry. The DVD will also be the focus of a continuing education session for the Indiana Racing Commission program that I mentioned earlier. Currently on the plate of the Shoeing and Healthcare Committee is developing a recommended national test and study guide for horseshoers. Here again, it is necessary to chip away at resistance. The importance of the horseshoer is widely recognized and appreciated. It makes sense to take all reasonable steps that they have a high level of knowledge, especially since in recent years the industry has thrown at them the challenge of adjusting to a new dynamic in racing surfaces. Mitch Taylor and the committee have spearheaded this ongoing plan, whose initial step was an extensive survey of their colleagues. We come now to the Racing Services Committee, chaired by Dr. Wayne McElraith. I hope I'm not being too arrogant to say that this was a home run originating from the first summit. And always with a home run, it required a splendid individual performance, but yet plenty of backup. I refer to the Racing Services Testing Laboratory, created after the second summit. Dr. Mick Peterson of the University of Maine originally got into the field of racetrack services when he and Dr. McElraith of Colorado State received a grant from the American Quarter Horse Association Foundation. With his interest thus piqued in the subject, Dr. Peterson has become something of a guru. There is quite an impressive aura of the academic around about Dr. Peterson, but he also is a pragmatic businessman. I will be brief about the creation of the Racetrack Surfaces Testing Lab because shortly Dr. Peterson will be at the podium here with his own presentation. In summation, the testing lab became a reality, combining Dr. Peterson's vision with the Jockey Club's willingness to provide seed money and solicit additional support from other industry sources. The lab offers the services of testing racetrack materials and evaluating all manner of its properties with an eye to establishing and maintaining the safest possible surface. Also, at great effort, Dr. Peterson and some of his colleagues created a white paper which set out the current state of knowledge of racetrack surface management. This white paper is available on the internet. We understood that this was far too large for the trade media to reproduce, but Dr. Peterson also has issued a series of one-page articles on specific areas of racetrack management, which can be found in your booklets, those of you who have booklets. Connected with these efforts, I've been an engaged bystander at the field day for racetrack superintendents organized each year by the NTRA. I've been highly impressed by the obvious dedication these professionals have for providing the safest track they can produce. Track surface superintendents have to be very savvy about heavy equipment and the practicalities of day in and day out racing, and it is a job that has always had the aura of doing things by the seat of your pants without much academic support. Given the opportunity to hear from academia, these guys eat it up. They are not only willing to listen to scientists, they are anxious to. They hung on every word when Dr. Stover addressed their workshop 2 years ago, and they have accepted Mick Peterson as their ally. Again, I will defer to Dr. Peterson's later presentation for more detail. Next committee is Racing Equipment and Safety. Dr. Peterson is also intimately involved with this other committee, the Racing Equipment and Safety Committee, which is chaired by Jeff Johnston. This committee involves itself with a wide array of subjects, as you can imagine from the title. One of them is the crops used by jockeys. On the one hand, you might think that jockeys and their equipment are somewhat veering away from the name welfare and safety of the Racehorse Summit, but we believe the two are intertwined sufficiently to justify our addressing some of these subjects. One of the goals of the committee is to seek a balance between the traditional use of the whip, the practicality of what a whip or crop should be utilized for, and the public's perception that whaling the daylights out of a horse is anathema to prevailing precepts about animal use. Through a long process, the characteristics of what is referred to as the safety crop have been sought and identified. This is an inexact science, as you can imagine, with various opinions being brought to bear. Understandably, to a jockey who has always viewed the crop as a fundamental part of his livelihood, any dramatic change might be seen as a challenge. Accordingly, in the manner of competition in general, there seems always to be a minority who seek to gain an advantage through inappropriate means. The use of the riding crop appears to be no different. Reports surfaced of riding crops that by all appearance conform to the standards, but which in fact had been carefully modified to render more force than the design was intended. The comments made by Travis Tigert, the CEO of the USADA, United States Drug Testing, at the Roundtable Conference comes to mind. Win at all costs is the philosophy of some. Well, enter the professor from Maine again. Dr. Peterson and his colleagues have developed a machine which can detect when an improved safety crop has been tampered with. Dr. Christy Mahaffey will be demonstrating that machine later this morning. I'm reminded of the catchphrase which came out of the Jockey Club Roundtable presentation about medication, to wit, 1.5% of the trainers are accounting for 100% of the public perception. Dr. Mahaffey, who will be presenting the crop testing information, will address how to detect when a jockey is trying to game the system to the detriment of fair play and the horse. I want to emphasize that when we approach this subject, we are again trying to restrain a small minority from sullying the whole game. This is not an open salvo against riders in general. Also under the purview of the Racing Equipment and Testing and Safety Committee is an effort to encourage tracks to create their own safety committees. Here we have heeded a comment made at the last summit by Nick Nicholson, beware of unfunded mandates. We are on board with the reality that our summit, if it produced a lot of lofty goals which would cost racetracks thousands of dollars, that would be poorly placed in today's environment. We have sought to be pragmatic and idealistic at the same time. Safety committees at racetracks are envisioned as adding no expense to any party, unless the committee discovers a physical problem at the racetrack that requires fixing. You will later hear a panel on existing safety committees and how they operate. In short, this is a matter of bringing together existing personnel to discuss problems when they occur, with the aim of learning from what has just happened and trying to avoid similar incidents or reduce the likelihood of recurrence. Another committee is the Racetrack Environment and Training Practices Committee, which is chaired by John Harris. One of the key subjects assigned to this committee is the claiming rule. At the first summit in 2006, Hall of Fame trainer Dick Mandela, from this podium, brought up the fact that he recalls with regret that as a young man trying to get started, he was subject to the temptation to run a claiming horse when he knew he probably shouldn't run because he hoped the horse would be claimed and become someone else's problem. It is a reality that such temptation is present in numerous instances. Mr. Mandela offered a solution, the idea that if a horse had a catastrophic injury during a race, the person who had claimed it would have the option of avoiding the claim. The psychology is that a trainer faced with oncoming soundness, of a problem of oncoming soundness, would have little or no incentive to risk the horse by running him when he and the owner would be stuck with the animal after the race if it did in fact suffer an injury. The claiming game and the implied caveat emptor of its traditions are a core of American racing, so naturally any tinkering with it was met with skepticism. This might have been an idea which never got past the talking and idealism phase, but the California Horse Racing Board stepped forward and instituted a new rule. Like many simple goals, there is complication, and the phrase, "the devil is in the details," comes to mind. In this case, the details included determining just when an injury should trigger the option to void. As I understand it, the California rule is still being tweaked, but I have confidence it will achieve the basic goal of reducing the incentive to place a horse knowingly at risk. New York recently enacted emergency regulations that could void a claim for a horse that is vanned off the track within certain parameters, at the discretion of the claimant. In addition, the existing rule where a claim is voided if a horse dies on the racetrack remains in place. So we have recent and ongoing movement towards this goal that Dick Mandela articulated. And again, I'm not claiming that this was all started by the summit, but we have, at least we've been in the background. We did endorse, our committee endorsed the California program, and I hope that's been helpful. I should also cite that there is already a precedent for voiding claims which the horsemen have accepted. I refer primarily to the New York rule, which allows for voiding a claim if the horse claimed tests positive after the race in question. Another direction taken by the Racetrack Environment and Training Practices Committee was seeking to formalize the sharing of vets list and stewards list. Again, Encompass stepped up to provide free of charge a module through which tracks can share these lists. Today, all Encompass customers tracks are utilizing this important tool to try to cut down on a horse race in one jurisdiction when he or she is declared temporarily ineligible somewhere else. The committee is also in discussion of alternative training methods and practices which may in the future lead to reforms at racetracks. Later this morning, a panel of trainers will be discussing some of these aspects. The last committee I will report on is what we call the Durability Committee, of which I am the chair. This committee set out with the ideal of calling attention to stallions and sire lines whose progeny excel in statistical indicators that would suggest soundness and durability. We zeroed in on two statistics. One, average number of starts per starter by a stallion, and two, percentage of overall foals which get to the races. With a steep decline in average number of starts from 11 per year to down to about 6 over the last half century, we felt that certain breeders seeking to buck that trend could benefit from knowing what sires and sire lines have indication of perhaps a better likelihood of more racing longevity. Well, the first run-through included virtually all stallions, and it called attention to a large number of deceased and aged sires, so it was not sufficiently helpful to breeders. We moved instead to a list which includes only stallions that ranked in the top 200 in terms of progeny earnings for the year. That meant that all the stallions looked at had at least a modicum of commercial viability and proven quality of progeny. Then we rearranged that group by the two measures of average number of starts per starter and percentage which make it to the races. While we harbor no illusions that this is a huge strategy creator for all breeders, I think it sheds some lights that many breeders can use. I would not imagine that the list would help a high-fashion breeder choosing between two of the great stallions of the time, but in many other strata of the breeding population, I hope it has been of interest to breeders in choosing among stallions in the 5 to 10 or lower stud fee ranges. To the buyer of day-to-day stock and to the breeder breeding to race, these lists are additional tools giving some hint of the resulting foal's likelihood of being sound enough to race and perhaps to race more frequently than the prevailing average of the breed. For the last several years, we have published these lists in the Grayson newsletter, Research Today, which is printed annually in the Blood Horse magazine. If you are not familiar with them, I recommend that you access them on the website. If you go to the website and click on Media Center, you can call up the latest newsletter. I think it is also worth noting that ideas and initiatives which have been first identified or discussed at this summit have led to recommendations from the Jockey Club's Thoroughbred Safety Committee or to agenda items in the Roundtable Conference. This summit, in essence, serves as this industry's think tank, or at least one of the think tanks. So, 6 years after the first Welfare and Safety of the Racehorse Summit, we are still, that word again, slogging away. I know when you use the word committee, there are a lot of rolling of eyes and mentally marking it down as just one more exercise coming to nothing. I again commend the committees of the summit, which have continued their work, mindful that results might not come as speedily as we might wish, but determined not to lose sight of the goal. The work continues, and what is best for the racehorse remains the guiding principle. Thank you.